Hello, my name is Andy Schmuckler. The idea that we are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be, for me, goes back to 1970 when an idea came to me that has continued to seem valid and that I've built upon it ever since. That book back there, The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, showed to my satisfaction, continued satisfaction, that it's inevitable that any creature that steps onto the path of civilization is going to unleash a destructive force and drive its civilization to develop in ways that it didn't choose, it wouldn't have chosen, but it could not avoid because of if you look at that step in an evolutionary perspective, it's really quite an extraordinary moment, unprecedented in the history of life. Going back, lately, they're going back 4.2 billion years for the history of life, and it's just 12,000 years since human beings started onto the path of civilization and inventing their way of life. Enormously important. I don't know why people haven't paid more attention to it. But anyway, it indicated that the way things have unfolded has been dictated by systemic forces to which human nature was comparatively irrelevant. And I know from now years of talking to people about this, it's very hard for people to imagine that systemic forces might drive things in a way so that that whatever happens in the human world must be a clear reflection of what human nature is. But that's not so. That's the point, that when you get to systemic forces, it's just a situation in which only certain kinds of things survive into the future. And that has to do with the disorder. And I'm not going to go deeply into that proof, but suffice it to say that I was interested in reading everything that people had to say about human nature, because I wanted to understand, well, how much are we to acquit ourselves of a lot of the ugliness that we see in the human world? And I believe that the answer is that at least the pages of human history are not a clear picture that they would be like that no matter what kind of creatures we were, if we had the qualities that are necessary to invent something like civilization. That basically, I try to say, the spirit of the gangster, for systemic reasons, the spirit of this gangster will be given a disproportionate say in how the world develops. So when I was reading everything that I could find about human nature, this was back in the early 70s, there were two basic takes on that. One were people who really did not think we had much of an inborn nature worth talking about. It sounded like this descendants of an early 18th century idea of the tabula rasa, a clean slate that any culture can write on. Well, cultural influences are really significant. We are cultural animals, and that's a whole story worth exploring in some depth too, because culture really does change the game, but not like civilization does, which introduces the disorder that creates a systemic force that drives things in the direction of what can prevail in a war of all against all. There are people who seem to think that some anthropologists saying like there are 1,000 different human natures, each culture, but that misses real boat. I mean, it's not like we emerged out of evolution. You know, it's the process leading to us being Homo sapiens goes through a whole lot of stuff, and even before we become cultural animals, there's a whole lot that's already been built into us, like into any other creature. And there's no reason to assume that there's going to be a selective process which eliminates that stuff that was there from the beginning. After all, our hunting gathering ancestors were still living pretty much the way their primate ancestors before them had been living. So why wouldn't they still be, you know, basically well guided by those things that were selected for in creating our primate ancestors? That brings me to the importance of the evolutionary perspective in this particular point. Though you can talk about complications, as a general rule, whatever there is that's inborn in a creature is there because those of the ancestors in that gene pool who were heading toward having that as part of their organismic design were more likely to get their DNA into the future than those that lacked it. That's, I think, a key to a whole lot of stuff. If it's there, if you can pretty well establish that it's built into the genome of the species, you can infer that it's been selected for, meaning that in that vast process, which has led to all these complexities out there, where many seeds go out and only some will mature to drop their own seeds. Inevitably, there's going to be a non-random process, and the things that end up being in part of the future will be there for reasons that prove to be life-serving. Aside, I believe that you can talk about life-serving in relation to something meaningful to call the good, but let me just leave that as a footnote. As there is something you can talk about in terms of the good, and the good being necessarily something which is part of the creature's inherent experiential world. Because if there were a cosmos in which nothing experienced anything in any way that mattered one way or another, well, there's no way anything could matter. There could be no better and there could be no worse. But in an evolutionary perspective, we see that creatures like us and my kitty cats and lots of others do have a dimension of experience which is a better and a worse. Fulfillment is the essence, in a sense, of better life. Life fulfilled versus death and misery or whatever are necessarily the way that value gets measured. And we have been, in human nature, we have been selected to have certain experiential tendencies. We're not all identical, but just like with our physiognomy, my face is different from your face. And in the same way, my face is like your face, as you and I are probably both born with some built-in experiential tendencies, one of which has got to do with the dimension of better and worse as we see it. And the betterness of it correlates with being motivated to seek out the better and to avoid the worse, in experiential terms. And the fact that it's been selected for that particular sorting out of what's better and what's worse, whatever has been selected for has been correlated with getting the creature to do the things that would lead to their survival, and more specifically, that they're surviving to get their DNA into the future, so they become their descendants. We are the descendants of a lot of creatures who are more successful than some of their fellow creatures in getting their DNA down into the future, which makes us their descendants and them our ancestors. That's a core thing about, I think, I don't know whether it's adequately looked at. It probably is. I often wonder how much I've been thinking about and studying evolutionary theory for over 50 years, but sometimes I wonder, is there something I'm missing that's important? For example, I didn't realize about all the horizontal gene transfer until the last decade or so. I thought it was all sort of straight down, but it turns out that different species exchange stuff. Okay. Well, my impression is that overwhelmingly it is quite legitimate to say, if that's there, it must have been life-serving through the mechanism of those that had it were motivated to act in ways that led to survival and getting their DNA into the future. And that's true about, a whole lot of things, like eating when you're hungry and drinking when you're thirsty, and all kinds of things that we're motivated to do. And even, as I say, even though we are not born all the same, I think that there's every reason to believe that we have important inborn experiential tendencies that are as parallel as the various anatomical things. Some toddlers are very active, some are more peaceful. There are all kinds of human variations. But beneath it, there's an evaluative dimension, for example, in which if you mapped all the 8 billion human inborn tendencies in terms of what's better and what's worse, what people are born to be motivated to seek out, and born with inborn motivation to avoid the experience because of that dimension of better and worse, if that there would be a non-random quality, and that the ones that the inborn evaluative dimension of all the 8 billion people, if mapped, would basically line up for doing kindred things that in the past, ancestral past, helped our ancestors to survive. So people are motivated to do, unless they get broken, which is a whole nother story about human nature. What we see is a world in which, because of forces like that, a destructive force that inevitably emerged, there's a lot of brokenness that resides in the people, and that resides in the systems in which those people are having to operate. And so you get a lot of ugliness that's because of the selective process of a non-biological sort. It doesn't take human nature. It takes whatever aspects of human nature will survive in this disordered situation, will be most likely to prevail in a war of all against all. Doesn't tell you about human nature. Any creature that is capable of inventing its own way of life has an inborn plasticity such that if there's a selective process that's going through the various permutations of broken people, it will find forms of brokenness that lead to the emergence of that gangster spirit that I say has had a disproportionate say in shaping human civilization. there's more. The better and worse dimension, I think, can be utilized in an intellectually responsible way to demonstrate in that evolutionary perspective way that the better and worse constitutes a meaningful moral dimension. It doesn't answer all the questions, but once you get better and worse established as a reality, which having to do with fulfillment and with the perpetuation of life, once you get to that point, it is possible to derive. You've established the reality of the thing. And we human beings have enough in common regarding that reality that we can meaningfully talk with each other about what's better and what's worse. Enough that's shared. Just like we can go to a dentist and they know before we open our mouth what they're going to see. But in addition to that better and worse part that provides a foundation for the moral dimension to be real, important, and life-serving, it being correlated with motivation to perform the actions that lead to survival, which leads to the selection for whatever motivated you. But in addition to the moral dimension, there's another dimension which I've been stressing because I really think it's germane to A, the battle we're engaged in now in America, and B, to why it is that the side of the good has not been as strong as we need for it to be. And that's been true for a long time. And that is something that you might call the spiritual dimension. I'm much more of an intellectual guy than a spiritual guy. And so I place a very high value on the spiritual dimension of experience that I've had a few episodes of that have basically guided my life. And I have some envy of people who are, I don't know, appear to me to be spiritually more enlightened than I. Nonetheless, looking at the human story from an evolutionary perspective, we can see that one of the experiential capabilities that we are born with as a species, and I don't know if this is everybody, it doesn't seem like every life manifests it, so maybe it isn't there in some, but as clearly a very large proportion of the human population. I don't know why I think this, but I've studied it a little bit. The 1/3 of the people you might find, well, in America, if you ask them to about whether they've had experiences of a certain kind, get back to the kind in a second. 1/3 will say that they have, and that kind, and it's not easy to put it into words, but it's got to do with like things seeming really, really true and having a profound impact, and people coming back from the experience with what they regard as important spiritual truths, and that this place that they got to being sort of special, like Moses by the burning bush. There's something happening here which is setting this moment aside, and people have those experiences. Sometimes, they're the what's that Christian phrase? The reborn. But they're around the world and in different cultures. I think you can find different people who enter into what they experience as sort of a deeper, different, more sacred, perhaps, dimension of reality, including sometimes shamans of little groups in Siberia, or wizards in some group in the Amazon. It does seem like it's widespread that there is in the human genome sufficiently widespread that wherever you see people living as a society or as a culture, there will be some people who are having experiences of a special nature that they experience as a special thing. And a couple of things that can be observed. One is that the impact of these things are often great enough to say these are very powerful experiences. And that's been true for me. And I think it's true for a lot of people who have this moment or something of realization or, hearing a voice out of the burning bush or whatever, and the course of their life changes. And for me, it was that idea in 1970 that I'm still hoping to be able to convey more fully than I've succeeded. Please go to abetterhumanstory.org. But anyway, that's my shtick, and I've had a couple of other experiences that also changed the course of my life, and it also felt special, and it also opened my eyes to some reality deeper and more important than the usual way I see things. But that's all over the place. And different people in different societies have these experiences. And the societies tend to treat these moments of spiritual transformative moments that might be brought back to the group by individuals. It is often the case that some kind of a sacred text will develop. But in any event, it is obviously an experiential capacity that's part of the whole human story. And that also draws for immediate inference. I mean, like I said, there are some exceptions about whether something is actually life-serving. What comes to my mind, I think this is a good example, is the peacock feathers of the male peacock, who works for NBC. It's such a splendid display. I believe that they've come to believe that sexual selection, not meaning that it's better for survival because it's more adaptive to the wider environment, but if the female likes those tail feathers, they're going to get more and more of them. And I think maybe that with one of those antler animals, a similar thing, that there's been sexual selection for such a big rack, actually maybe maladaptive. But I don't think that with this business about the capacity for spiritually transformative experience, and that's the phrase I think I would like to use for it, the inborn experiential capacity for spiritually transformative experience. I think we can infer that it must be there because it proved to motivate people to do the things that were better paths to take than what the people who didn't have those experiences took. Otherwise, why would we have this semi-universal capacity? I would guess, particularly if it's just a minority of people, but like 1 out of 10 or whatever, I would guess that there's also been a selection for people who have these experiences and are able to transmit them to the societies, and the societies have been influenced by these things. But the fact that they get it into the future, this capacity, into us collectively, I think means that what people brought back from there motivated them to do what was life-serving, and life-serving meaning will get your DNA into the future. You won't be one of the dead ends. Or you're less likely to be one of the dead ends. So the spiritual dimension is also a source of good guidance, and good guidance for serving the good, defined as fulfillment and the perpetuation of life. I get confused about how much is a perpetuation of life in itself a good, but fulfillment is for sure a good. We are shaped by a process which is continually, and was, since we are one-celled creatures, or even before that, if there is a before that. I mean, the cell did not emerge at the very outset, but is the selection process in a biologically evolving system is continually choosing what can survive over what cannot. In a sense, you could say that even though I don't consider it value in the sense of a better and a worse, that's another quick story. It is the better for getting into the future. Whether that's better or not, that which dies doesn't, without getting its DNA into the future, has failed in the game of evolution. You win by getting your DNA into the future. And then at a certain point, that selective process is selecting for experiential tendencies. And I've talked about two of them, the better and the worse, and the mundane experience, and then down here at the very deep well of reality that people have experienced as, oh, this is the sacred, or the idea of good versus evil, I think, resides at that. And both the moral dimension and the spiritual dimension feed, tap into, or no, that's not the right way of saying it. They're both the source of passions. There's the source of ways of thinking, of perceiving things, the source of passions. And if you're plugged into the moral and spiritual dimensions, you're going to be more able to act with the understanding and the passionate power that this survival of what's good requires. And here in America, in recent times, we've had a secular worldview arising in which the moral dimensions and the spiritual dimensions are not granted the reality that they deserve. They are not granted the honoring as long proven sources of good guidance that they deserve. And I believe that's part of the weakness that the pro-democracy forces that are basically aligned with the good in America in these times, to fight the fight that needs to be fought. So understanding that human nature includes these treasures that are these tendencies that are there because they're life-serving. And those aren't the only two. But that reality is a doorway into a real spiritual commitment to this battle that it must be won. And we can see that the Democratic Party of this era has had a hard time getting those moral and spiritual passions out there in a way that, well, maybe to connect with them, because the secular worldview has not had a way of incorporating the realities of these things so that they get the respect that they deserve. And that's what I'm trying to do with my Better Human story, is to establish, using the evolutionary perspective, that these things are real, important, and life-serving, and offer us a kind of power that's been missing from this battle, in which Yeats's line continually has been coming to me since 2004. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with a passionate intensity. We can get to real conviction within a responsibly held secular worldview, which has been expanded in an intellectually responsible way, utilizing the evolutionary perspective that enables us to see we have within us guidance toward the good. Our creative intelligence, when we stepped onto the path of civilization, inevitably would unleash a problematic, destructive force that I say, actually can be described in a way which fits the traditional understanding of evil, other than it's not being supernatural or personified. There are realities about the human